So with no further ado, Flowers for Automated Malware Analysis, Chengyu Song and Paul Royal.
Thank you. So I'm Paul Royal. I'm a research scientist at the Georgia Tech Information Security Center. This is Chengyu Song. He's a PhD candidate at the College of Computing at the Georgia Institute of Technology under the advisement of Dr. Winky Lee. And today we are going to talk about anti-automated malware analysis techniques that, if ubiquitously implemented, could mean flowers for automated malware analysis. So we're going to start by providing a very brief overview of modern malware. Much of the material will probably be remedial for most in the audience. And then we will dive into a history of malware analysis technologies to determine how defensive tools have responded to changes in the threat landscape. And with that as a motivating segue, we will begin talking about the fundamental nature of the detection, prevention arms race, and the possibility of inverting that model in a way that, again, if ubiquitously adopted, would permanently disadvantage the process of automated malware analysis. I'll then turn the talk over to Chengyu, who will discuss in greater detail the techniques we have devised, and then provide some discussion of them, including the particulars of their operational security, as well as potential countermeasures. We will then provide briefly some concluding remarks and open the floor to questions. Modern malware is the centerpiece of current threats to the internet. It's used to build botnets. It's responsible for over 90% of the unsolicited email we receive. It's used to steal information and can sometimes directly be involved in the financial fraud committed using the theft of that information. Malware is used to build, is used by real criminals to build criminal infrastructure that collectively acts in the domain of organized crime in what has become a multi-billion-dollar shadow economy. There is thus a pronounced need to understand the behavior of malicious software, to discover, to the extent possible, automatically new threats, to identify assets compromised by those threats, to determine what happened after compromise occurred, and ultimately restore affected assets back to their benign working condition. Of course, there's a lot of money involved, which means that malware authors have direct financial incentivization to make this process difficult. One of the earliest anti-analysis, which is almost more of an anti-reverse engineering technique, was often referred to as packing, and more generally obfuscation. And in this overview, which is somewhat grossly oversimplified, program A, which can be malware, is run through an obfuscation tool to produce program A prime, and the machine code in program A is encrypted, compressed, or otherwise transformed into seemingly benign data. And that is coupled together with a small amount of code that at runtime will reverse this transformation. Of course, the actual obfuscation technique can be considerably more complex and in some cases novel. 4 years ago, I and another researcher participated in DEF CON 16's Race to Zero contest. This was a contest where participants were given known detected malware and required to transform it in a way such that it still behaved maliciously, but was no longer detected as malicious. For that purpose, we created a tool that we never released or shared, but used to compete in the contest. And to demonstrate the efficacy of this tool, I took an old, in the wild, Bifrost bot malware sample and uploaded it to VirusTotal. And as you can see from the screen, the sample has almost 100% detections. I then used the ZeroPack tool we had created to obfuscate the sample and uploaded the ZeroPack obfuscated version to VirusTotal. And the sample, again, does not behave in a benign manner. It still behaves maliciously, it just looks different. Differently enough to the point where detections go from almost 100% down to 0. Attackers have gotten good at this type of obfuscation. They've been able to automate it at the server side. It's called server-side polymorphism. In the traditional host-based antivirus model, there's a point in time on the leftmost portion of the top figure of this slide where malware is authored and then a point in time where it is released, and then assuming that it is not automatically detected by existing signatures or heuristic detections, some small amount of time, it can be as little as 12 hours or less, or as much as days, where detections are created for this particular malware type, or perhaps other members of the same family, and detections are pushed out. In server-side polymorphism, shortly after malware is installed on a system, the malware sample will connect to the command and control and request an update. And that update won't necessarily behave differently, but it will look differently, sometimes dramatically different. And so by the time a given version of malware is detected, say version N, that version is no longer on people's systems. It's long since updated to version N+1 or N+2 or N+K for some arbitrarily large integer K. And when this is done professionally, by professional malware authors, you get detections that look a bit like those of the Wolodeck botnet. To highlight Wolodeck's use of server-side polymorphism, I collected 2 Wolodeck samples on different dates, but uploaded them to VirusTotal on the same day. The first sample I collected at the end of 2008. The second sample I collected on the same day that I uploaded both samples to scan. So the first sample is well detected. Detections are almost 90%. The second sample has much lower detections, even though the 2 samples, as a function of their execution semantics, aren't really any different at all. So in this case, Wolodeck's use of server-side polymorphism comprises a 60% detection efficacy delta for traditional host-based antivirus tools. Another recent evolution we have seen in terms of obfuscations is the use of ISA virtualization in malware. In ISA virtualization, again, a program, which may be malware, is irrevocably transformed as a function of having its machine code turned into bytecode for an unknown, arbitrary attacker-decided language. So this would be analogous to converting into something that's like Flash bytecode or Java bytecode, except you don't know the execution semantics of the ISA. This bytecode is coupled together with an interpreter that will execute on the x86 platform, and the original intentions, or the intentions of the original program, are fulfilled by the interpreter interpreting the bytecode that has been bundled. So now that we have, now that we're all on the same page with regards to what the parts of the modern threat landscape look like, let's briefly review how defenders have handled these evolutions. In the beginning, there were in-guest tools that would perform automated analysis of suspect samples or known malicious samples. And given that they were in-guest tools, they would reside in the same environment as their analysis target. And in many cases, this made them vulnerable to the detection of the monitoring instrumentation they had to use in order to record and condense the actions of a sample or process of interest. And if you perform one of the most straightforward implementations of, say, Windows API hooking, what you will do is use the Windows debugging API to receive notification of DLL load events. And when you receive that notification, and again, that's a DLL being loaded into the malware sample as it's executing, you will look at the export table of that DLL, and you will go to each of those functions that have been exported and place an unconditional jump at the start of them that will trampoline into a patch of analysis code. The problem is that you have created hooks that you cannot hide if you choose the most straightforward implementation. And so what you see on this slide at the bottom is a small block of C code that will take a function that is likely to be hooked by such tools, and it will get a byte data pointer to the start of that function, and then determine whether the first 2 bytes correspond to the opcodes of an unconditional jump. At some point, people determined that they needed to get outside of the guest so that there was no internal monitoring instrumentation to detect. And so they started creating reduced privilege guest virtual machine monitor-like software components, which would operate similar to VMware. And these, prior to the introduction of hardware virtualization extensions, would operate through a combination of sensitive data structure relocation and binary software translation. And those were both done for reasons of performance. Now, reduced privilege guest virtual machine monitors are vulnerable to the side effects they create for the purposes of enhancing performance. And as a concise example, older versions of of VMware, if you were to execute a program that contained the sysret instruction, even if it was executed in ring 3, will be treated as a no-op. Sysret requires ring 0 and thus should generate an exception. So in this case, it's the difference of the presence of an exception that can be used to identify a reduced privilege guest virtual machine monitor. Simultaneously, some people decided to get outside of the guest by modifying existing whole system emulators. And a whole system emulator, like QEMU, ultimately has the responsibility of emulating the full ISA of an x86 processor, which is a very complex piece of hardware. And the problem is that there are corner cases where emulation is not correct. And you can leverage the difference to identify instances of what are basically unfaithful CPU emulation. What you see at the bottom 3 panes of this slide is basically a series of inline assembly that executes the IRET-D instruction with the 0x26 prefix. 0x26 is not a valid prefix for IRET-D, so the combination of these bytes, when executed, should produce an illegal instruction exception. The exception will be handed to the structured exception handler, which is installed initially, and the execution of that structured exception handler begins the actual execution of the malicious program. In QEMU, something like IRET-D is actually executed instead of an illegal instruction exception, and the program will actually silently fail and simply exit with no structured exception handler. So about 4 years ago, people began investigating the use of hardware virtualization extensions to perform malware analysis. And these operate through, again, extensions to the x86 ISA. Intel's example is VTX. AMD's example is SVM. And these are represented as new instructions like VM-on, VM-start, and so forth. What these effectively created was an additional ring of privilege, like a ring -1. There was a VMX root mode and a VMX non-root mode. Guests execute in VMX non-root mode, and that includes the ability to execute in ring 0 in VMX non-root mode. But of course, there's a subset of x86 instructions that are fundamentally incompatible with virtualization, and when these are executed, a special event will occur that drops back to VMX root mode, and that event is called a VM exit. Fundamentally, if you have VM exits and you are the hypervisor, you must handle them correctly. And if there are any implementation details you have omitted, that will cause execution inside the guest to fail. And as a case in point, KVM, a popular hardware virtualization extensions-based virtualization container, and the version of KVM that shipped, for example, with Debian Linny, which was the stable version of Debian through February of last year, had a bug in it where if you executed a VM read inside the guest, instead of throwing an exception saying that this should not be supported in, without VMX root mode, the entire guest crashed with an unhandled exception. So not only is this a detection attack, but it's also a denial of service. So what I've described previously are really anecdotes that can actually be generalized into transparency shortcomings. And from those generalizations, you can create a set of formal transparency requirements that an analyzer must possess in order to be transparent to the malware that it is analyzing. So I'll briefly cover those. The first is higher privilege. That simply means that the analyzer must have or operate at a higher privilege level than the malware it is analyzing. Otherwise, the malware can detect its presence and even attack the analyzer. The second requirement states that it's okay to have side effects so long as access to them is through privileged instructions at a higher privilege level that is preemptible by the analyzer. The third is same instruction execution semantics, and that basically means that if I execute a block of code inside a virtualization container or with an analysis tool present, it must have the same semantic effect as if the analyzer was not present. The fourth, identical exception handling, means that if the sample of interest creates an exception, it must be handled and delivered to that sample in the same way as if the analyzer was not present. And the fifth requirement, identical notion of time, simply means that there should be no reliably measurable, unaccounted gaps in time. that the malware sample could use to infer the presence of an analyzer or an analysis environment. So if we look at how traditional tools stack up, in-guess tools, because they reside in the same environment as their analysis target, do not have higher privilege, emit non-privileged side effects, and often have exception handling issues due to the associated need for careful implementation. Reduced privilege guest virtual machine monitors, for reasons of performance, often also emit non-privileged side effects, and whole system emulators like QEMU or even Symix, which is a cycle-accurate CPU emulator, suffer from a lack of identical instruction execution semantics. To make matters worse, detection techniques previously relegated for more sophisticated forms of malware or more technical malware authors are now available to any novice cyber criminal. And as an example, if you look at the first half of the slide, you will see a subsection of a screenshot taken from a point-and-click, do-it-yourself remote access Trojan generation kit. This is basically the analysis resistance section of that. You can just point and click your way into detecting a number of different popular virtualization containers used for malware analysis and even circumvent certain sandboxes. If you're a more sophisticated malware author, you may want to defer the process of making sure that you do not execute an analysis environment to another specialist in the criminal underground who will make a tool that will provide these detections for you. And as an example, you could PayPal $50 to rdgmax@gmail.com and get a copy of RDG Tejan Cryptor, which, as you can see from the screenshot, contains detections for about 15 different virtualization containers and analysis environments. So the point of these screenshots is that malware analysis environment or tool detection is now a standard and commoditized feature. It no longer takes the technical expertise it once did, and it's very accessible. When we look at popular malware, we will also find anti-analysis or anti-virtualization associated detections. Configure checked for a relocated local descriptor table, which would detect reduced privilege guest virtual machine monitors like VMware. TDL4 will use the Windows WMI query language, which is an SQL-like language that can be used to interrogate a number of system features, including the hardware, to identify the presence of device simulation. And it can be something as simple as a label that says QEMU hard drive. Bretalab does functionally the same thing by directly interrogating the hard drive via the device I/O control Windows API. So what we've seen thus far, as a function of considering that we could actually invert the detection model, is that until recently, malware was environment analysis aware. It would look for a variety of virtualization containers or analysis environments, and in the absence of successful detections for those items, it would assume that it is not in an analysis environment and execute successfully. However, there is no reason why malware could not be analysis environment oblivious, the inverted representation of the environment aware model, which means that malware will bind to and successfully execute only on the original infected host. It will assume any other environment in which it is executing as an analysis environment and will not execute successfully. And this exploits the observation that malware is overwhelmingly collected in one environment and executed in another. And as a case in point, the Georgia Tech Information Security Center, which is just a small academic center, collects over 1 million new malware samples each month. And new simply means unique by cryptographic hash and previously unseen. So it's a very large volume. About 100,000 of these samples are collected through our own internal collection infrastructure. The rest we get from malware exchanges and client submissions and other such things that are effectively a representation of external collection. So the question is, have we started to see, or have we recently seen, malware that uses, albeit even if in a primitive manner, this inverted model? And the answer is yes. Flashback, a large Mac OS X botnet, which grew to about 600,000 systems, towards the end was propagated via drive-by downloads. The drive-by download was represented as a malicious jar file, which contained two class files, which would exploit CVE 2012-0507, and a small 40 kilobyte Mach-O binary. And that Mach-O binary, via the exploit contained in the class files, was installed and executed on the system. Now, that's not a full version of Flashback. That's actually an intermediate download agent. And that agent would gather the hardware UUID and submit that to the command and control along with a request for the full version. The command and control would compute the hash, in this case MD5, of the hardware UUID. And by the way, the hardware UUID, which is available via a Mac OS X API, uniquely identifies a particular Apple device, like the laptop from which I'm presenting. So it would take the hardware UUID, hash it, and use the MD5 sum as a decryption key into an RC4 stream cipher that would effectively bind the full Flashback version to the particular host that was compromised. Which means that if you were to take a Flashback sample from another infected Mac and try and run it in a virtual machine or on another physical system, it would not run because the hardware UUIDs don't match. The only way to successfully execute a sample collected in that manner is to match the hardware UUID of the original infected system. So Flashback put into motion a sequence of events that unfortunately can be matured and may eventually become commoditized and even ubiquitous. And so the question is, how bad can things get so we can try and prepare for the coming storm? And to talk about some of the specific techniques we found in our exploration of what future versions of Flashback-like entities would look like, use this inverted model, I'm going to turn the talk over to my co-speaker, Chengyu Song.
Thank you, Paul. Now I'm going to introduce how automated malware analysis can be defeated. Let me first explain a little bit about our goal. So automated malware analysis techniques is basically created to handle the large volume of malware samples collected every day. And so our goal is not to make each sample unanalyzable, but instead we're only to make this automated process ineffective and unscalable. And to do so, we're going to leverage some techniques that was previously reserved only for digital right management system. And this works is because DRM for malware is quite different from DRM for legitimate software. For legitimate software, the DRM system has to protect every copy of the protected content. And even one copy gets cracked, that copy can be widely distributed, and that means the protection is broken. But for malware, because every sample is protected by its own DRM system, and you have to analyze every sample, that means you have to crack each sample. And if we can make this cracking process slow enough, then you won't be able to handle the hundreds of thousands of samples you collected every day, which means the automated analysis technique is broken. And to do so, we're going to use modern cryptography and to use it to bind the malware instance to the host that it originally infected. And more specifically, we're going to use two techniques. The first is the host identity-based encryption, HRE, and the second is instruction set localization, ISL. So here is a figure showing how HRE works. HRE works very similar to existing hacking tools. But instead of using a randomly generated encryption key, HRE will collect information that can use to uniquely identify a host. We call it a host identifier. And use this host identifier to derive an encryption key that we're going to protect the malware binary. And because of this similarity with HRE and the existing hacking tools, we see no difficulty for attackers to adopt this technique or even come up with similar ideas. Well, HRE seems simple. There is some details needs further considerations. And the first is what to encrypt. A straightforward idea is going to replace existing hacking tools, which is HRE, and encrypt the whole binary. Therefore, if there is any difference between the runtime host identifier and the infection time host identifier, the unpacking will not be successful, and the malware will not be executed. But this may not be a good idea, because this fail to execute event is a very good signal for the analysis program. It can leverage this signal to speed up the cracking process. If you are familiar with how to crack encrypted binary. So instead, we suggest using HIE as a complementary technique and only use it to encrypt critical mechanisms. For example, the domain names used to connect to the command and control server, or the metadata you use to generate those domain names, or IP lists that you use to build up bootstrap P2P botnet. By doing so, even if the decrypt is not successful, the malware is still going to do something, and hopefully if the analysis program is not clever enough, it will treat this information as crack information and be misguided. And another thing to think about is what can be used as a host identifier. Because there is some difference between malware DRM and legitimate DRM, malware DRM has its own requirement. The first requirement is unique. The ID has to be unique, which is easy understandable. And the second requirement is invariant. So if the information we use is unstable, then these mechanisms can kill malware itself. However, unlike a legitimate DRM system, this information needs only to be stable for as long as the malware campaign is. So that means it could be just days or weeks. And the third requirement is we should be able to collect this information without any privilege. Because when you are going to infect the system, you may not have any special privilege. If you collecting those information requires privilege, you have to exclude those hosts from your infect target, which is not good. And the fourth requirement is the information should not come from any special hardware like TPM. And the reason is similar to the third requirement. Here is the list we think can be used as the host identifier, and the target is Windows platform. The first piece of information is a subset of process environment block. More specifically, we're going to use username, computer name, and CPU identifier. The second information we're going to use is MAC address. The third information is GPU information, and it can be retrieved from a standard API call. The last information is the user security identifier. This is a string randomly generated by the Windows OS and is unique across the Windows domain. One thing to notice is we haven't looked into file system and registry yet, but we believe there should be more information that can be used as host identifier. Once the host identifier is collected, we're going to feed it into a key derivation function to generate the key, the encryption key that we're going to protect the malware binary. This KDF takes three inputs. The first is ID, which is concatenation of all the information we collected. And the second input is a sort, which is at least 64 bits. It's going to use to prevent rainbow table attack. And the last is the iteration number or work facts. This is used to control how fast you can derive a key. And by using this, we can really control how fast this HIE's protection can be cracked. For the KDF, we suggest using bcrypt with the work facts of at least 10, or the SHA hash family with at least 100 iterations. And the last thing to consider is deployment. To deploy a binary that is protected by HIE, we need to collect the host identifier before we can send the malware to the client for installation. And usually, when you attack the computer, the shellcode is short and it is not capable of collecting and submitting those information. So as in Flashback, we have to use some intermediate download agent. But one particular problem with the download agent is once the analyst captures this download agent, you can use this agent to download samples that is binding to the analysis environment and analyze it there. To solve this problem, we propose using short-lived one-time URL that is also used in password reset process. So by using this, one shellcode is only valid to download one and only one intermediate downloader, and that downloader is only valid to download one and only one HIE protected malware instance. That means once the downloader is used, you cannot reuse it again to get another sample. HIE's protection has several advantages. The first is it uses modern cryptography. So knowing how the key is derived does not compromise the integrity of its protection. And the second advantage is it's sample independent. So even if you have two samples from the same malware family, even it's just invariant of the same malware binary, information collected from cracking the first one will not give you any advantage of cracking the second one. Now I'm going to introduce the second technique, which is instruction set localization. We introduce ISL to solve one problem, that is, pure host-based protection mechanism is not sufficiently resistant to forgery. This is also a problem for legitimate DRM system, and to solve this problem, they have added one feature called always online. And some systems even do it more aggressively. They are going to decouple some function from the client and put it into the server. For example, the recently released game Diablo 3. In that game, all your character data is stored at the Blizzard server. So even if you can crack the client, without being able to successfully authenticate your client to Blizzard server, the client is not playable. So ISL is going to do similar things. First, it will use the CNC server to authenticate the malware client based on both its host identifier and network identifier. And secondly, we are going to decouple malicious functionality from the binary, so any offline analysis is not possible. By doing so, we think we will turn malware become much like platform as a service. That means the HIE protected binary we send to the client does not have any malicious functionality, but only acts as a bytecode interpreter. And the real malicious functionality will be served as bytecode tasks. And by combining the IS instruction set architecture ISA for that bytecode to a specific infected host, if you change the host, you will get a bytecode that is encoded in ISA that is differs from the ISA that malware understands. So the malicious task will not be interpreted correctly. And if you think binding ISA to a specific host is too complicated, we also provided an equivalent effective way that involves a task encryption and decryption key, which I will introduce later. So here is a figure explaining how ISL works. On the first side is the malware binary. Again, it has no malicious functionality and is protected by HIE. Once this executable gets executed, it will collect the host ID and submit it into to the CNC server and ask for a task. On the second side is the CNC server. It will collect the runtime network ID and combine it with the runtime host ID to generate the ISA for that malware binary, and use this ISA to encode the real malicious functionality into bytecode and send this bytecode to the binary to interpret. So as you can see, if there is any difference between the runtime IDs from the infection time IDs, the ISA will mismatch and the task will be interpreted incorrectly. Again, we think ISL is very similar to existing instruction set virtualization techniques. So we see no difficulty for attackers to adopt this or come up with similar ideas. And here is two attributes we think can be used as network IDs. The first is geolocation. We choose it because the IP address is usually not stable enough. And we choose to use this information as a granularity of a state or province level so we can tolerate a certain level of mobility. And the second attribute we're going to use as complementary is autonomous system number. Because sometimes the geolocation can be out of date or can be incorrect. And because this information is collected at the CNC server side, we believe it's intractably difficult to forge. And this is how the task encryption and decryption key works. Very similar to HIE, when the malware is going to be installed, the server will collect its infection time host ID and network ID to generate a key which will be embedded into the malware binary. We call this key the task decryption key. And during the runtime, when the CNC server receives the request from the client, it will use the runtime ID to generate a task encryption key and encrypt the task still encoded in bytecode with this encryption key and send it back to the client. The client will then use the embedded decryption key to decrypt the task and begin interpreting it. So, as binding an ISA to a specific host, if there is any deviation in the runtime IDs from the infection time IDs, the task won't be decrypted correctly and the interpretation will be incorrect. And because all the keys is generated at the server side, we're not going to use the same KDF, but we are going to replace it with a key hash or HMAC with a key that is kept secret at the server side. As HIE, ISL has several advantages too. The first advantage is the binary sent to the client does not have any malicious functionality. So even if you can crack HIE's protection, you will not be able to analyze the program because you don't know what this malware is capable of, what it's going to do. The second advantage is the malicious functionality is encoded in an ISA that binding to that particular host. So even if you can crack HIE's protection, connect to the CNC server and retrieve the task, if your network ID or host ID differs from the infection environment, you won't be able to interpret that task correctly. So you won't be able to know what task this malware is going to perform. Now I've introduced HIE and ISL. Let's talk more about their tech protection. Both HIE and ISL is based on modern cryptography. So unless you can provide the same execution environment, you won't be able to bypass their protection. And in case you cannot access the original infected environment, this means you have to go through the entire configuration space and search for the one that is used by the infection host. And because this configuration is controlled by attackers, they can choose an arbitrary combination of informations and how many information to include. This configuration space can be arbitrarily large, which means searching through it may not be feasible. To make things worse, some configurations, like network ID, may be impossible to duplicate. The second advantage of HIE and ISL's protection is they are insensitive to analysis techniques. So the general knowledge of how they works does not provide any advantages. This is different from knowing how a malware is going to detect your system, because once you know how malware is going to detect your system, you can provide fake information to bypass their protection. But HIE and ISL does not have this weakness. And regardless of at what granularity you are going to analyze the program, either by instruction or at high level doing system call trace or network trace, unless you can provide the same execution environment, you will not be able to bypass their protection. So now we've talked about the HIE and ISL. Let's talk about some potential countermeasures. The first and most straightforward idea is why not just analyze the malware in the original infected environment? Well, we don't think this is feasible because that means you are going to allow the malware to execute on the client, which means you're going to allow otherwise blocked, suspicious, or malicious functionality to be executed. This means this can have a huge impact on the business operation and continuity of the client you promise to protect, and may have complicated privacy and policy issues. And another idea you may think is, if the infected host is a high interaction honeypot, is that okay? Yes, it's okay to analyze the malware inside the high interaction honeypot. But high interaction honeypot has its own problems. First, it's hard to maintain, and it's not deployed in large scale. And you really don't have the control to say when this honeypot are going to be infected and how many malware will infect this honeypot at the same time. Besides, samples collected by high interaction honeypots comprise only a small portion of collected samples every day, compared to like a sample submitted by client, sample collected by low interaction honeypots where you don't have any analysis capability, and malware exchanged from other parties. So another idea is, if we cannot analyze the malware in the originally infected host, can we just collect those information and duplicate those information inside the analysis environment? We think this is also infeasible because depending on the information used to generate host ID, you may have privacy or policy issues. For example, the attackers can choose to use your Google Sign cookie as the host ID. So will it be willing to submit this to your AV company just for analysis, a binary collected on your client? And to make things worse, to duplicate the network IDs, you're required to deploy analysis environment at a massive global scale, which we have never seen before. And here is another idea: is if we cannot duplicate the network ID, can we just collect the host ID and record and replay the networking interaction between the malware client and the CNC server? Without additional protection, this can bypass ISL, but this can be easily mitigated by using SSL, because SSL is designed to resistant to log and replay. And the last idea is, if we cannot analyze the malware, can we just change these protection mechanisms against themselves? To do so, we're going to launch a large attack. That means we're going to make the information used by HIE and ISL unstable. For example, we can change the MAC address or the SID for every program execution. So the malware won't get executed at all. But this information, the problem is this information is also used by legitimate software. So if you provide the unstable information, you may break their functionality. So the success of this protection mechanism really depends on whether the user was willing to trade usability over security. So in conclusion, historically, malware has been analyzed its environment well, but recent development has shown malware can also be analyzed its environment oblivious. And primitive DRM-like techniques, like used in Flashback, can be matured into something like HIE and ISL. Therefore, future work must mitigate these protections or consider alternative ways to identifying and understanding threats. As a reminder, please fill out your feedback form. Your feedback is very important for speakers to improve their presentations, and it shapes the very conference you are attending. Thank you.
So at this point, we would like to open the floor to questions. And if you have a question, please come up to the front and speak into the microphone.
If I understand you correctly, then this host information gathering and HIE happens during the, let's say, installation process of the malware on the host machine.
I'm sorry, it's hard to hear you right now. Could you speak a little bit louder and a little more slowly?
If I understand you correctly, then all this host information gathering and the HIE happens during the, let's call it, installation process of a malware on the host machine.
That is correct.
So if I would be able to get an installer of malware, then no problems for me.
Well, so again, the intermediate download agent, as well as the shellcode, will contain a one-time use URL that is short-lived. And so if you're able to capture the intermediate downloader agent, if it has already been used even once, say to infect the originally infected host, you won't be able to use it again because the one-time use URL will have been extinguished.
How about using a tool such as like HB Gary's Incident Responder Pro, where you could collect the RAM on an infected machine before performing remediation? You got kind of a static, dynamic, kind of hybrid binary that you can continue analysis on. Any ideas for that?
That should be effective. Unfortunately, it's not scalable. The primary purpose of these techniques is to prevent the automated analysis of several 100,000 samples a day, and not so much to prevent a knowledgeable defender or incident responder from being able to understand a particular piece of malcode.
Thanks.
It seems like the basic technique of that was presented here seems to skew more towards automated dynamic analysis.
That's correct.
Okay. Whereas if there would have to be an exposed algorithm, I would think, for either the HIE or the ISL that would not conform to known industry standards like legitimate DRM or a Java interpreter or a VB interpreter, something like that, which I would think would be vulnerable to automated static analysis being found.
Well, I think the goal is not necessarily to replace conventional obfuscation techniques with HIE and ISL, but use them in complement to HIE and ISL. So you would continue to use traditional obfuscation techniques that would make the malicious portions of program code appear as seemingly benign data. And you can take, again, an off-the-shelf commodity packer or obfuscation tool, modify its source code so that automated unpacking tools based on a priori knowledge would not work, and then use that as an additional protection in an effort to prevent automated static analysis.
Got it. All right. Thank you.
Regarding the scalable issue you were talking about, how about using fuzzy hashes to identify similar samples that have like this pattern, and then uses automatic diff of the files to like find these kind of samples and like start automatic analysis?
Without the again, without combining more traditional obfuscation tools, that probably could be effective. But unfortunately, you could have many thousands of distinct malware families all obfuscated by common tools that are subtly modified in a way that a priori knowledge-based automated unpacking tools would not work. And so that could be partially successful and would probably depend on the complexity and resourcefulness of the attacker.
Thank you.
As the analyst, what's to stop you from having the malware infect your analysis environment?
Well, the question is whether you can, in at least the overwhelming majority of cases, replicate accurately the circumstances of compromise. And so if you were to try and grab an intermediate artifact like the shellcode or the downloader, there are one-time use URLs. And let's say that you were to use a targeted spear phishing attack. And a PDF file. Presumably, the shellcode executed by the PDF file with whatever exploit it's going to execute would also be one-time use. And as Chengyu mentioned, higher in action honeypots, if you can replicate the circumstances of compromise would be effective. And similarly, if defensive organizations can disregard organizational self-interest and come together, presumably we could create basically a sort of a global alliance of analysis systems where not only can we collect and duplicate the host level identifier, but also be coming from the same parts of the network, namely the same state or province and the same autonomous system number, which would correspond to an ISP network.
Okay. One other one on that, when you use like the host name and the computer name and all that, that seems like that would make for an easy mitigation task then, where your system has been infected, so go and change all the computer names and the malware won't work anymore.
That would be a good way, and there's obviously an implicit trade-off in what information you're willing to change on what basis. I think it would be considerably harder to change your MAC address for every program invocation, because obviously the switch would have to recognize the new MAC address and permit the associated network connectivity with that change. If there are no more additional questions, thank you very much for your time.